Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and today we're going to be doing a complete disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Stryfe. Now, the Stryfe is a magazine-fed, battery-operated, flywheel-powered blaster. We're going to take a look at the controls and various locks. There are a number of locks in this blaster. Some of them are purely mechanical, others are mechanical and electric, and some are just electric. So, to start with, we have a trigger below our main trigger, which is the rev trigger. You pull it to operate the flywheels. We have a magazine release right here, our main trigger, and a jam door. Those are really all kind of the basic controls. The blaster will not rev unless you have a magazine in it. Now it will rev. And you'll notice when you let go of the rev switch, it does take a while for it to slow down. It just naturally slows down with friction and all of that. If you remove the magazine while the blaster is revving, it will shut down, but it'll again shut down slowly. However, if you open the jam door while the blaster is revving, it comes to a halt very quickly. And that is because the jam door lock has motor braking, which we will go into later. There is a final lock. You cannot, even if you pull the rev switch, you cannot pull the trigger unless the magazine is in place. So there is a lock on the trigger from the magazine. Now that we have a magazine in it, and we pull the rev trigger, we should be able to fire. However, I only loaded 2 darts. Now the magazine is empty, and we once again cannot fully pull the trigger. And that is because this is an older model of Stryfe that has the empty magazine lock, which I will show, but I will also remove, because the newer models don't even have it because it was nothing but trouble. So let's take this thing apart. Start by taking out the batteries. Alright, we'll start by taking out all of the shell screws. Now there are 2 screws that are a different size on the outside. That are the ones in the rail, as is often the case. Now, Stryfe screw ports are smaller than a lot of other Nerf blaster screw ports, and you will need a number 0 Phillips in most cases in order to. My number 1 will in fact not fit into the deeper screw ports. It'll fit on the more shallow ones. Now remember, if this is your first time opening the blaster, you're going to want to put a little extra pressure on the screws when you go to remove them, a little extra pressure on the screwdriver, and give the screwdriver a sharp twist to pop the seal, as it were. When Nerf blasters are assembled, I believe, or my theory is, I don't actually have any proof of this, but they actually use the screw to tap the thread in the screw posts, and so there is generally a fairly tight seal, and if you don't apply sufficient pressure and give it that good sharp twist to break that seal, you'll often end up stripping out your screw head if you're not careful. And I do have a video on how to deal with stripped out screw heads, but it's better if you just don't, so be sure to add that little extra pressure. All the rest of these shell screws, exterior screws, are exactly the same size, so it doesn't matter what order you put them in. Only those 2 rail screws are different size. Train? Good. Should now be able to open it up. Excellent. Now, in older blasters, again, this was a little bit more common. I've seen it. It's not very consistent, shall we say, where interior screws are silver and exterior screws are black. Not always the case, and sometimes there's some mismatch. For instance, here, the motor mount screws are black, but all the other interior screws are silver. We'll start by taking out our cosmetic items, our sling mounts, our... Oh, that lock's just going to take itself out. This was the empty magazine lock that I will explain how it works and where it goes, but I will be leaving it out when I do the final assembly because they're horrible. We can take off half of the front rail up here as well as the rail nubbin there. If we want to take off the muzzle, barrel, and all of that, we will need to take out our motor screws, which are a longer screw than the rest of the exterior screws. So we have 3 different lengths of black screws. Short ones for the rail, long ones for the motor, and then regulars medium for the rest. There. Motor is now loose. We can pull it out. We have the muzzle and a small bit of barrel. We have a pair of small silver screws holding in our cable channel cover. We then have a large coarse threaded washer headed screw that holds on our pusher. The 2 parts of the pusher are held together with a smaller washer headed screw. We'll go ahead and take them apart. Our trigger is then also a larger coarse threaded washer headed screw. I do recommend using a larger screwdriver for both of them, or you risk stripping them out. We have a small washer headed screw holding in our mag release assembly. Be careful when you take the mag assembly out. One of the springs is not captive and is very prone to springing and getting shot across the room. A pair of these small silver screws holding on our plate here for the magazine lock. 3 parts there, the plate, a link, and a spring-loaded part deep down in there, though it does have a fairly captive spring, but again, be careful about springage. Finally, we have one last small silver screw holding the plate on our rev trigger assembly. Be careful, the rev trigger spring is fairly captive, as is the lock. Well, that one's actually not terribly captive, so again, be careful of springage. Now the rest of this, I can now pull up all of my switches, and they will all simply lift up and out. But I can't take them out all the way because they are soldered onto the battery leads, and I'm not going to desolder. The last thing I could disassemble, but I'm not going to, is actually the flywheel cage. It is just clipped together, but there are a pair of screws on either side that are holding these spring-loaded flaps in place, which, as far as I can tell, are just designed to keep the dart centered as it's pushed into the flywheel. They used to go with a rubber housing that you push the dart through in order to keep it centered, kind of like a whisker biscuit on like a bow or something. It's just designed to keep the dart perfectly centered when it hits the flywheel. So if they got popped up or the pusher doesn't push it in straight, this should align it. It's not, strictly speaking, necessary. I'm not going to take it apart because it's got fiddly little torsion springs, and I don't want to deal with them. I recommend either just taking them off and leaving them off, or just leaving them in place. Odds are, if you're meddling with the flywheel cage, you're replacing it entirely, and your replacement flywheel cage are not going to have those anyway. So we will leave that alone. And now we will take a look at our switches. They all just lift out. They're not glued in or held in any way. And then it's all still soldered in place back here, and I'm going to leave that in place. We do have a small thermistor board, which I will explain later. So, let's take a look at the circuit real quick, just so you can understand how everything in this is working. We have positive coming off our from our battery housing on this white wire here, going to the rev switch. Now, this is a open or closed rev switch. If the button isn't pressed, then it's open and the circuit is not complete. If you push it, it closes the circuit, and the circuit is complete. Positive should go to the, doesn't actually matter which one it connects to because it's either open or closed. But in this case, from the battery it goes to the furthest pin from the button, and then it comes back out on the blue one coming out here. Colors may vary from Stryfe to Stryfe depending on what colors they used throughout the production life of the blaster. But the blue then goes up to our magazine lock switch, goes to the back one, and then it connects through to the orange on the top. We then get to the complicated switch, which is our jam door switch, which is a proper normally open, normally closed COM. The pin furthest from the button is the normally open, the button closest is the normally closed, and the center is COM. And what comes out of COM depends on what the position of the switch is. So when the switch is pressed, it completes the circuit to the orange line that is coming from our magazine release, our positive circuit. It completes that through to COM, which then sends positive to the positive lead on the motors. We've got negative coming from the battery to the negative lead on the motors, and they will therefore spin if this button is pressed and both of these other two switches are pressed. When it's released, however, it completes the normally closed, which is the green wire, the negative wire coming from our thermistor board, and it will therefore complete negative through the COM, which means we have negative going to both sides of these motors, which will therefore halt the motors. Having negative going to both sides makes them work against each other, basically grounds it out, and it will halt the motors, or bring them to a halt much quicker. So that is how the circuit works, and how all of these switches, what positions they're in, matters. We will now start reassembling, and we'll see how the locks actually work. We will start by doing the front barrel section. We have our muzzle assembly as well as a short section of barrel that just goes in there as far as it can go. Lift up the motor, the flywheel cage so that you can get the barrel in, and then it will all slide back down. We then have our rail lock nub, and we have the other side of the rail. That all goes in. You can then actually, at this point, secure it with one of the standard length screws, because this portion is not actually part of the main shell, so you can put that in so it doesn't come loose and your nubbin doesn't sproing itself. We can then put our 4 motor mount screws in. Now, thing to remember when putting screws in is always rotate it counterclockwise until you hear or feel it clunk down into place. That is the thread on the screw aligning with the thread in the screw port. And if you don't do that, you run the risk of getting it misaligned and stripping out your screw post by doing what's called cross-threading. Remember I said that these screws cut their own thread when you put them in. Well, if you don't line up with the thread that it cut the first time, it'll cut new thread. And if you do that enough times, it'll chew up all of the plastic, and there won't be anything that the screw can grip. If it is difficult to put the screw in, then you're almost certainly cross-threading. It should be easy to put the screws back in because they've already cut the channel once. If it's really hard and you're really having to push hard to get it to go in, you're cross-threading back out, align the screw, and then put it back in. Next, we're going to put our cable channel cover back on. And I really like that they added this because it just makes everything on the inside a lot cleaner, a lot less likely to get snagged on something. You're not going to catch it on, like if you're trying to clear a jam, or the magazine isn't going to catch on your cables or anything like that. So it's a nice little addition. Alright, we could then put our jam door on, and you can see that there is a bit right there that interacts with that switch and pushes it down. So when the jam door is closed, this switch is pressed, which means we're connected our normally open, which is the positive line. When you open it, the button is unpressed, and we end up getting the negative, which is our motor braking. So that is how the jam door is operating that switch. It is just an electric switch that is actuated by that. Okay, let us zoom in and start reinstalling some of the smaller bits. The next part we are going to install is going to be our magazine release, catch and release. The first part is this part. And it is going to fit into this spot right here. Be careful, like I said, that spring is not captive, so if you're not careful when you're putting it in, you can shoot it across the room and never to be seen again. That goes in there. We then have two parts that kind of need to get put in at the same time. They're this part and this part. And they simply go together like so. So the elongated slot is pointed up. This little knot ridge right here is pointed down. And then that simply goes down onto that post. So that there's a knob on the actual catch part that comes up into there, and that is how that will operate. It is then held in place by one of our smaller washer-headed screws. And now when you push it, it operates the release. Fairly straightforward. There isn't any kind of a lock on it because there's no bolt to worry about getting damaged if you try to pull it out when it's not primed. This doesn't have that kind of a system, so you're free to operate the magazine release whenever you want. We'll take a look at another lock that's slightly above it. This is the magazine lock that prevents you from pulling the trigger or revving if you do not have a magazine in the blaster. The first part we're going to put in is this little part, which has two notches and a ridge, so there's really only one way that it can go, and it goes in this square just above the switch. The spring is fairly captive, but do be careful with it. It should go right there and be able to go up and down fairly straightforward there. Next part is this part. And it's going to go in and it's going to feel like it's an upside down because the empty spot is pointed up. But it is going to go down over the top of that so that the square cutout there goes over the first part we installed, and the tab sticking down on the bottom goes in front of the switch there, so that when it gets pushed forward by a magazine coming in, it presses this switch and forces this little knob down. And that is how it deactivates the locks, both the electric lock and a mechanical lock. This is both of those. We then have a plate, this plate, that goes down over the top of it. Again, the cutout goes over that first piece that we put in, and then we will use a pair of these small silver screws to secure this plate. Now this plate has a ridge that sticks up and covers a hole in the shell that is there to keep bits of junk from getting into your blaster and mucking up the works, whether it be Lego or wood chips or whatever. They tried to make it so it's harder for parts to get back in here. Not impossible, but it's a little bit more difficult, and having that ridge was nice. Okay, so now when we push this, I don't know how well you can see, but that nubbin there gets pushed down, and that releases the trigger when you have a magazine in. It's also pressing that switch. Alright, shift again. Now we're going to take a look at the locks on the rev switch. So we have this part. This is the trigger lock, and the spring is going down with the cutout facing up, and it's going to go in underneath our rev switch there. And again, it's not a terribly captive spring, so be careful, but it goes in right there and can go up and down. We then have our rev switch, rev trigger, and it's going to go in here in the front so that its spring lines up with that bit of the shell. When you push it, it both pushes this switch and forces down that lock. So once again, it is both a electric and a physical lock, a mechanical lock. We then have another plate. That goes right over the top there and uses our last small silver screw. Again, now when we press this, it both pushes the switch and deactivates the lock, disengages the lock. Zooming back out, we are now going to install our trigger, which just goes on the post right above the trigger well, and needs to be in front of this and in front of, or over the top of that. This is held in place with one of the two large coarse-threaded washer-headed screws. And while it definitely looks like there was supposed to be a return spring, there isn't, though a lot of the full auto kits will include a return spring right there. Now, without a magazine, without pulling the rev trigger, this trigger is thoroughly locked. There are two locks, mechanical locks, holding it in place. Just pulling the rev trigger will not unlock it. We are still locked. We have to have a magazine in, and now it is unlocked. And since there's no return spring, it'll just flop about. If we pull rev but don't push this, it locks. If we have a magazine in but we don't push rev, it still locks. Both of those need to be unlocked at the same time. Now this lock, I would argue, is largely unnecessary. While revving when you don't have a magazine in is a waste of battery power, it doesn't risk doing damage to the blaster. The same with being able to pull the trigger without having a magazine in it. It doesn't actually cause any harm. You're not really risking breaking anything. So I'm not entirely sure why they included that one, but they felt it was necessary enough to do it. This lock I do consider important because you don't want to be able to pull the trigger if you're not revving the blaster, because if you do, you can push a dart into the flywheels when they're not spinning. Then if you try to spin them up, you will draw stall current from your motors because they're jammed, they can't move, and so they are stalled, and you will pull the full stall current. And this is where the thermistor comes into play. I said I would talk about it. The thermistor is in place to protect the motors and the batteries and the system in general from having too much current go through it. You can put as much voltage as you want through it, but if you try to put too much current through it, the thermistor will heat up and it will, inside will disconnect and it will break the connection, it will break the circuit, and the blaster will turn off. And it won't be able to turn back on again until the thermistor cools down, which doesn't take very long, but it does take a little bit of time. And the only cases where you're ever likely to have that happen is if you pull the rev trigger and hold the rev trigger while the blaster is jammed, because that will cause the motors to pull stall current, which might actually be enough current to pull this out, or to flip this. This is also something that you absolutely have to remove if you're going to put in more powerful motors, because all of the more powerful motors, whether they be honey badgers or anything else, draw more current than this thing is capable of allowing through. And so it will trip every time you try to use more powerful motors if you haven't removed it or disabled it. You can disable it simply by twisting it and connecting the two sides, but that is not best practice. You're better off taking the screw out, taking the solder out, and then resoldering your green and your black wires directly to your negative line. If you're replacing the motors, you're doing soldering anyway, and it's much better to remove them than to just disable them. You can, but again, not best practice. It can lead to some issues. So that is what this little board is for, and when and how you should remove it. Next part we are going to put in is going to be our pusher, which consisted of this part and this part. It's fairly simple how it goes together. The oblong lock there, the oblong hole there goes over the little nubbin. Next thing we're going to do is reassemble our pusher, which consists of two parts, this part and this part with a spring on it. And it simply goes to the long slot there, goes onto the pin, and then it is held together using the last of our small washer-headed screws. And this provides us with some mechanical advantage by being a lever of sorts. It's now going to go onto the post that's right above our trigger. That post goes into the slot as well as into the hole. The lower lever arm should be between the two posts on the trigger. If it's not, then it's not going to work properly. But it kind of won't fit if you... I mean, you could have it behind that one, but you'll notice that the pusher is now out, and it's going to be bad. So it needs to be in between those two. and it is also held in place with the last of our silver screws, our last large coarse-threaded washer-headed screw. The trigger and this both have those because they are load-bearing parts. They're going to have a lot of torque put on them. Now, when we have our rev trigger pulled and we have a magazine in, we can pull the trigger and it will force the arm forward, and its return spring also acts as our trigger return spring. So that's why we don't have a trigger return spring. Having them both would be awkward. I imagine they originally tried having it use that spring and discovered it was insufficient, so they added that. They must have found it was better. Or they had both and they felt the trigger was too heavy. Who knows? Now, if I were going to put this lock back in, here is when I would put it in. It goes right here up on the top of the mag well, and it pushes down when there isn't a dart in the magazine. Now, if we have a magazine in and pull the rev trigger but the magazine is empty, the pusher will hit the back of that and we can't pull the trigger. The problem is that if you've got slightly worn darts, or they're not aligned perfectly, or for various other reasons, this lock would engage even though your magazine wasn't empty and would get you in all kinds of trouble. So not only did we immediately tear these things out, Hasbro has since quit putting them in the newer models of Stryfes. So I'm going to leave it out. Final things to put in are our cosmetic things. We have our two sling mounts. This one I always manage to install incorrectly. The knurled section is the part that should be further forward. If you try to put it in one way and it doesn't fit, try to put it in the other way, and then you'll realize it was right the first time, you just didn't align it right. It's like a USB. Alright, and then we also have one on the bottom, and the knurling will be towards the back, just to help you with that a little bit. Last bit that we have to install is our top rail lock nubbin, and now we can reassemble. Remember, when you put the shell on, it should go on easily and smoothly. The seams should all close. There shouldn't be anything forcing it open. If it's not, don't try to force it, because something is probably misaligned. And if you try to force it, you might be smashing a wire, you might be smashing a spring, you might have an internal bit that's out of a line and you're going to end up cracking it or something. So open it back up, figure out what was misaligned, and close it gently again. First two screws we're going to put in are our smaller two that of course go up here in the rail area. If you try to put one of the longer ones in, it will in fact go all the way through and you'll end up with a white dot on the top of your rail, which can interfere with rail attachments. So all of the rest of them are the same, so it does not matter which ones go where. Alright, we're fully reassembled. We'll check all of the controls again. Revs, yep. Won't rev without a magazine. Cannot pull the trigger without a magazine. Magazine in, cannot pull the trigger. Rev, can pull the trigger. I have removed the lock so that I can pull the trigger even though it's on an empty magazine. And motor braking still in place. So there it is, the full disassembly and reassembly of a Nerf Stryfe. I do realize if I'd used a blue one, it probably would have had better contrast on the video, but this was the one that was conveniently at hand. The survey for what blaster I do next is still down in the description, so feel free to vote on the blaster that you would like. Commenting which blasters you want me to do next doesn't do any good. I pick it based on what has the most votes. If this was helpful to you, then by all means leave a comment, give it a like, share it with your friends, let people know that these videos are available so that we can hopefully help more people. And thank you guys for watching.